Good evening. I'm Stephen Pugnani, Head of Marketing here at the Institute of Science. Welcome tonight. On behalf of the Freshwater Forum at Cranbrook Institute of Science and the Nature Conservancy, I'd like to say thanks for stopping by. The fourth of our 6 lecture series in the What's So Great About the Great Lakes series here at the Institute with the Nature Conservancy. Our next lecture is March 21st. I'm sure many of you already signed up. Most of you are series buyers, and we really appreciate that. And that will be Lindsay Chatterton, who will be talking about the Great Lakes food chain, and who will touch on invasives, so we're sure that will be a very popular lecture. I'd also like to thank tonight our sponsor, Northern Trust, and our media partner, Michigan Radio. Without them, this would not be possible. I also have a second thank you. Thank you all for working around the cannon in the lower lobby that you all stepped around. That is an 18th century cannon that was found in 2011 in the Detroit River during a routine practice dive. It was retrieved and has been at the Detroit Historical Society for the last couple of years. When we decided to do the Extreme Deep exhibit, we got in touch and said, you know, what do you have artifacts-wise? They were very generous in loaning artifacts from a couple Great Lakes wrecks, as well as they said, what about the cannon? So it's been the centerpiece of our conservation project in the deep dive portion of that exhibit, which is a look at the Great Lakes and the history of the Great Lakes. It is it was in a tank with electrolysis. It's been slowly doing conservation. So as this is midwinter break for a lot of schools, from 1 to 4 every day, including tomorrow, we've had kids with toothbrushes helping to remove the rust. It's real science and real archaeology and real history. They've removed a lot of rust. I'm a little nervous as the marketing person because we're supposed to do this again during spring break, and it's looking a little clean to me, but I was assured, no, there's lots more to do. We have determined this week, though, that it's not George III as we expected, but it's George II. The markings on it indicate that it was rejected for use by the Royal Navy. It was not up to their standards. It was probably sold to a contractor who then contracted it out to protect merchant ships. So as we scrub and clean, we'll be giving you more information before it ultimately goes back to the Detroit Historical Society. Our head of watershed education, Lisa Apple, who I'm glad to see is here tonight, shared with me today something else we thought might interest you. The International Joint Commission, which prevents and resolves water-related issues between the U.S. and Canada peacefully, as far as I know, in their 100-year history. They're presenting a forum at Oakland University on the 14th of March. Great Lakes, Great Challenges. It's free and open to the public. It's day long. The morning will focus on challenges facing the Great Lakes, such as the very difficult algae issue in Lake Erie, while afternoon sessions will target solutions such as green infrastructure. It's free of charge from 7:30 to 4 p.m., 7:30 a.m. to 4 p.m., free parking, and if you want more information or to register, please visit ijc.org and stop at the front desk if you'd like someone to write that down for you before you leave. Thanks. Our speaker tonight, Dave Ewert, is I hope I got that right, Dave, is a senior conservation scientist for the Great Lakes Projects, the Nature Conservancy, overseeing conservation work throughout the Great Lakes area. He works on winter habitat of the Kirtland's Warbler in the Bahamas. You didn't come back just for this, did you? If you came back just for this, thank you. Protection of stopover sites for migratory birds in the Great Lakes region, evaluation of wind energy relative to Great Lakes regional biodiversity, and Great Lakes coastline and island protection. Dave also teaches ornithology at the University of Michigan Biological Station and led science and stewardship programs of the Michigan and Iowa chapters of the Nature Conservancy, where he worked on fire management, invasive species, forest management, and other topics. I love scientists, they're always so busy. He was an assistant professor at Central Michigan University prior to working with the Nature Conservancy. He enjoys hiking, birding, and traveling around the Great Lakes and elsewhere. Before the lecture night, he was telling me about bringing home things like dead birds and possums, so he's been doing this for a long time. That was as a child. Dave received his BS from the University of Michigan and MS and PhD from the City University of New York. He's conducted research widely throughout the West Indies, Central and South America. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here at Cranbrook. Even as a kid, even as I was picking up dead birds and possums, I still read, and some of the favorite publications that I got my hands on were some from Cranbrook on the islands in northern Lake Michigan, and of course the Cranbrook publications on Kirtland's warblers. So it's kind of nice to come full circle a little bit here. So what I'm going to talk about here today is migratory birds, and specifically migratory birds in the process of migration. Hence, thanks for stopping by, both to you and to the birds. And this is all being in the context of the Nature Conservancy and the work we do, which is really, it's a very broad spectrum mission that we have, and that is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. A very broad mission that historically has been focused on biodiversity, and increasingly our scope and our vision and our work includes more and more socioeconomic factors that result in sustainability of these resources. So what I want to cover today is a subset of this topic, which is migration. We'll talk a little bit about migration, a little bit of the background on migration, some of the issues that birds face during migration, and especially in the Great Lakes area. I'm going to focus on landbirds because it's a group of birds we're most familiar with and see in migration in our backyards. Give you a little bit of the science behind this, and then finally how we use the science to take action on the ground and in other ways. So, what is a migratory bird? So, here I am sitting up here like this robin, talking to the robin's audience. And many of us spend a good part of the year in Michigan, go elsewhere in the winter. And like the robin, we've got one specific home in each place. And birds do the same thing. It's amazing that a small 1-ounce warbler has the ability to be in the same woodlot in northern Michigan, literally the same acre. And in the winter, they go back to the same acre in Jamaica or wherever they go. So this little bird that we think is not being particularly astute sometimes has this remarkable ability to get right to the spot where it's most comfortable and where it can survive the best. So, just to describe a pattern here that we'll be looking at, the life cycle of a migratory bird. So if we look at this figure, that whole area in blue, right, from here, this is September, October, all the way across to March, is spent on the wintering grounds. So a lot of the birds we think of as being typical Michigan birds, like this American redstart, are really they're really Jamaica birds or Bahamas birds. But they do spend some time here. And then at the end of the winter, in March, they migrate. And that's what this period of time is here shown in black. And this is a pretty hazardous time, as we'll talk about. And this is not one bird. It's going to take that whole period, but this would be the period in which redstarts in general are migrating. Then they come back up here to Michigan. They're particularly busy in Michigan because they're raising their young here. And they just spend all this time and effort to migrate because, as you know, a Michigan summer is full of insects, and that's what they feed their young. So this flush of insects brings them back up. Then, after they're done raising their young, they're kind of tired, and their feathers are worn out. So what they do is they molt, and they drop their feathers and replace them with new ones while there's still a good crop of insects for them to grow these new feathers. After the feathers are grown, they migrate again and head back down to Jamaica. We're going to focus on these two areas here, the spring migration and the fall migration. So, just a little background on how birds migrate. First of all, it's a broad front. By that I mean it's not like waterfowl that might have a real narrow corridor. So those of you that are birders know that tundra swans, when they move through Michigan, it's primarily a belt right through the center part of the lower peninsula where practically all the tundra swans move through in the spring. But not so for warblers. It's just a whole bunch of birds moving all across the state. So it's just this broad front. A lot of people don't know that they mostly migrate at night. They do that to avoid predation. The air column is more stable and it's not as hot, so they don't lose as much water and panting as they move through. It's a safer time to move. It's weather dependent. When birds come north in the spring, they do it with a south wind. That saves them energy. The opposite, of course, in the fall, they move with a north wind. They don't migrate that high above the ground, only 1,000 to 3,000 feet typically, but they'll go up and down. They kind of sample the air columns and find the airstream that gives them the best leverage. And they don't migrate in one fell swoop. There are a whole bunch of stops that they take between the breeding and the wintering areas and vice versa. So this blackpoll warbler you see here is one of the champion warbler migrants. It breeds up in the Arctic in northern Canada. And then they kind of, in the fall, they migrate down toward New England, toward the coast, maritime provinces, and they increase their body weight by 50% in fat. And then they just launch, and they go across the Atlantic Ocean down to the north coast of South America, eventually ending up in Brazil. Some of them don't make it, and if they hit a bad storm, they'll come down on whatever island they can find, and that might include a ship. So, migration is stressful, and the birds are vulnerable. And in the spring, in particular, stopover sites are important because they want to put on a lot of resources fast, because the first birds that get back in the spring get the best territories, the first females, and produce the most young. They raise more kids, and stopover sites are threatened. So because of all these factors, they've made our conservation radar. Now, birds die a lot during migration. So this is a black-throated blue warbler. The mosquito is taking a little blood there. And you see the mortality is 15 times greater during migration than it is at either the breeding season or the winter season. So that, again, underscores the fact that they're under a lot of stress. This has since been shown with a couple of other species, so this may be a more general pattern. And why is it so hazardous? Always weather. It could always be unpredictable. So some birds, for example, may come up. There might be a great period of warm weather, a lot of south winds, and they say get up to New Hampshire, and bang, a snowstorm comes down. Thousands of birds die under those circumstances. There are unpredictable resources. If you look at a plant species in any given year, there's going to be different amounts of caterpillars and insects on them, depending on weather and a whole variety of things. So they can't always know when they stop at a place what there will be to eat or what kind of shelter there will be. And there are predators, especially around the Great Lakes, because there are a lot of raptors that move along the shores of the Great Lakes. And when those migrants hit the shores of the Great Lakes, they're just waiting for them. And guess what else eats migrants? Anybody? Cats. Cats, we'll get to that. And something else that may surprise you. Gulls. Because the birds come down low over the water, and the gulls are there, they force them into the water, and with one gulp, they're down. So no matter where they go, they've got something after them. Now to that, we've added new hazards. Habitat loss. And by fragmentation, I mean the division of continuous habitat into small, isolated patches. A lot of invasive species that don't have the same amount of food for the birds. Water quality degradation. So a lot of birds eat midges and aquatic insects from the water, and if the water quality goes down, they lose that. The birds will hit towers and buildings, especially on foggy nights when the buildings are lit. Fortunately, there are a lot of campaigns taking place in Detroit, Toronto, Chicago, a lot of cities to turn off those lights under those weather conditions. And climate change, because as the climate changes, so do the timing of insect outbreaks, and that might not coincide with the time that the birds are arriving, because they tend to be responding to changes in light as days lengthen in the spring. So this is just to illustrate what can happen. Here's a beach with a bunch of dead birds. One storm in Lake Huron, it was estimated in a fairly short stretch of a shoreline that 250,000 birds were killed by one thunderstorm. So flying over the Great Lakes is not without hazards. And here's a thrush that's hit a building. So buildings that are especially near water, say in Chicago and places like that, when the birds are just coming off the lake, is a place where birds are more vulnerable. Now, to be really effective in conservation, we would know the migratory pathway of those birds from the breeding to the wintering areas. In fact, we know that for very few species of birds. So we don't really know how they're all connected, and we don't therefore know how to connect all the stopover sites very well. But people are beginning to work on that question. So a group of researchers from the Smithsonian and the Fish and Wildlife Service, they've been looking at records of banded birds. Some of you know that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issues small aluminum bands, and you can put them on the legs of the bird. There's a unique number on that band, and when you recover that bird, you know then when it was banded. So up here in green are areas where birds, in this case, this beautiful indigo bunting, where they were banded in the breeding season. And then the bird was found in Mexico and Central America during the winter season. By connecting the dots, you have a rough idea what the migratory route is. So what this is suggesting for the indigo bunting is that indigo buntings in the Midwest tend to winter in Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, down to Costa Rica. So that allows us to begin to get at the connectivity issue. And similarly, this is not an easy graph to interpret, but you see a similar pattern, that birds from the Midwest tend to be showing up in Mexico and northern Central America, in contrast to birds in the East Coast, which are showing up in the West Indies. So this gets us a step closer. And there are various other techniques that are being applied to get even more explicit. Migration through the Great Lakes is pretty amazing. It's estimated 100 million birds of 300 or so species pass through the Great Lakes region during each migration season. And they have to pass through a gauntlet of hazards. I've already talked about the issues with the Great Lakes. We've got a lot of cities. We have a lot of agricultural land. And this figure illustrates the relative risk of a migrating bird. So let's just say with that indigo bunting or that ovenbird, that here's the Yucatan down here. You can see it clearly, I'm sure. And they fly the 600 miles across the Gulf of Mexico nonstop, these small 1-ounce birds, 2-ounce birds. Then they land here on the Gulf Coast. If you got a north wind in the spring, they just drop down at the first land. They drop down in oil rigs. If the weather's a little bit better, they'll go a little bit inland to the hardwood forests that provide a little more food. But once they get here, they continue migrating north. You can see there's quite a bit of forest here shown by this green. But when they hit the Midwest, the lower Midwest, that white area indicates agricultural land. It's not good habitat for an ovenbird or an indigo bunting. Add to that Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, which are hazards to the birds. We all love them, but they're hazards to the birds. And then you throw in Chicago, Milwaukee, Toledo, Detroit, Toronto, Buffalo, Erie, and so forth, and there's not a lot of habitat. So for that reason, we're focusing on the Great Lakes area as a region to protect and work with stopover sites. Now, these stopover sites are really important for the birds. They rest. You can see a bunch of western sandpipers here all just taking a rest. And here you've got, this is not a hummingbird. This is a warbler, a yellow-rumped warbler, feeding on a fruit. So it's just, they forage here. So sites that have good food supply are the ones that are going to be best for the birds, and just shelter. So you have a good, say, a heavy conifer cover, or you have thick scrub, and then they're protected from the wind and rain and so forth. Now also, there's a nuance to this, that not all stopover sites are the same, so they've been roughly categorized into these types: fire escapes, convenience stores, and full-service hotels. And I'll go into just a little bit of detail on these. Now here's a fire escape, and what I mean by that is that it's a place where a bird lands because there's nowhere else to go. It may not be used very often. It may be that they're flying and a storm comes and they just drop down and they either drown if they hit the water, or they get to one of these fire escapes and just ride it out. So they're vital when they're used. They survive. And then they're selected during storms or other adverse conditions. So here's maybe the most vivid example right here of a fire escape, a boat in the Great Lakes. There are a lot of cases where people have been on boats and birds just come right on down and rest. And there was a captain who ran a freighter in the 60s, Captain Perkins, who noted this so often, he described what he called flyways across the Great Lakes and started putting plants on his freighter. So that was pretty good. They gave the birds some more shelter. It didn't, not a lot of food, but at least they got a free ride for a while, and they didn't end up in the drink. So that's a kind of a fire escape. And then you go a step up to a convenience store, a little bit bigger, a little more resources, a little more shelter. And then you hit sort of the granddaddy of them all, the full-service hotel, where they used a lot of high-quality food and shelter. So as you look across this area in the western UP, you'll notice that there's water, so the aquatic insects can come out. You've got deciduous trees, you've got conifers, you've got north-facing slopes, you've got south-facing slopes. If it's not good foraging here, the bird can fly over here and see if it's better over there. It's just perfect for a bird. So our conservation challenge then is that, first of all, we have to take a broad perspective. We have to protect stopover sites throughout the migration pathways, from breeding to wintering. So that spans states, countries, and continents, cultures, different economies. So it makes it a complicated conservation project. We have to choose between these different types of landscapes and sites, the fire escapes, convenience stores, full-service hotels, and be strategic about where we protect those different types of sites. Finally, there's never enough science, but we're trying to build that up. But we have to objectively apply this science when we're making these decisions. So now I'd like to also give you a little perspective, a bird's perspective, on how they look at these landscapes. I'm going to start out with how a bird first perceives where to land. They don't look at it on a site-by-site basis, but if they're flying up at 3,000 feet, their first assessment is going to be at a large, broad scale or a landscape scale. And the basic options they have are an intact landscape, one that was sort of like that western UP, the full-service hotel, or a fragmented landscape, one that's heavily affected by agriculture and urban, where there are not a lot of options. And another one that affects how the birds land and how they're distributed is proximity to water at a very large scale, like the Great Lakes, to smaller scales like rivers, wetlands, and inland lakes. So we'll talk about each of these. So an intact landscape might be something like this, where you have miles and miles of forest that the birds can find good spots. So that's a lot of the northern lower peninsula. This is at the Grass Bay Preserve of the Nature Conservancy near Sheboygan. And birch trees are particularly attractive to the birds. So this is NexRad imagery that you see on TV when they're showing storms and so on. The station is right here at Gaylord, and what these rings represent are just reflectance patterns of things in the air. You get higher reflectance the closer you are, regardless of how many birds there are, but this is a rough indicator of, you look at the relative color of this dark red, which is the highest density, to something like yellow, which is lower density, at the same distance from the station. And that tells you, the dark red, where there are more birds in the air. This is just at a very narrow angle, just as the birds are lifting off to migrate at dusk. And what this shows you in this part of the northern lower peninsula, where it's mostly forested, is that the birds are fairly evenly distributed. A lot of forest, and they scatter through, and that's good. If you get over here, it's different. A lot of orchards over here. These are some of the largest forest patches right here, and look where the birds are coming from. This is Sleeping Bear Dunes, National Lake Shore. Look at the islands. They're moving south because these birds landed here, and then when they take off, you can see the shape of the island taken off. So they found refuge on the island. So a lot of patterns you see here. If you look at a fragmented landscape in Ohio, this is Lake Erie, this is the Toussaint River, totally different landscape and consequences for the birds. Your remaining habitat are small patches like this, with a lot of agricultural land in between. You get water, which the landbirds can't use, and obviously you've got this barrier of Lake Erie right here. So the birds crowd into these remaining patches, higher densities, are competing more for food. They may not put on as much weight as birds in a more intact landscape. And at really an extreme, look at Chicago. So here's kind of the loop down here in Michigan Avenue. This is Grant Park. This is the fire escape. So birds will be flying in off the lake, running the gauntlet of gulls, and then they'll find a few trees right here where they can rest anyway, refuel a little bit. So now let's take a look at how the birds are actually responding. Here's Chicago. The purple is urban. The green is forest, so these are the suburbs with lots of trees. And the yellow is agriculture. These are the various streams and rivers. This is the Kankakee River. Here's the Des Plaines River here, coming up all the way here, and the Fox River. Now this over here is where the X-Rad station is. And you can see the rivers by looking at these magenta colors, which represents the highest density of birds. Kankakee, Kankakee. Here's the Chicago River kind of coming up here, the Des Plaines River. Des Plaines River coming here, right there. And the Fox River, if you look at this fork right down in here, here's where that fork is, right there. So these birds in this highly fragmented landscape are finding it and coming up. And so these are important areas to protect stopover sites. Now let's see how they respond to Lake Superior. This is X-Rad imagery out of Duluth, right here. This is right at dawn. So the birds over the land go down really quickly. And they'll come down, start feeding and resting. Birds out over Lake Superior are kind of caught. So what they sometimes do is they actually go up in elevation a little bit looking for the nearest land. And then when they get to the nearest land, they drop right down. So as a result, we often see a lot of birds along Great Lake shorelines. And this illustrates this. This is Lake Erie, right through here. This is Cleveland, Buffalo, Lake Ontario. Recall that these dark colors indicate where there are more birds in the air. This again is when they're lifting off at dusk, and they just parallel Lake Erie. Here and even here, different concentrations. You can see islands in Lake Erie popping right out. You can see Point Pelee, Rondeau, Long Point. And along Lake Ontario, the same pattern. So the shoreline is very important for us to focus on protection and maintaining habitat for land birds during migration. But when the birds land, they make other decisions. So then they look at a site and say, okay, where do I go once I've come down? Part of it is related to size. As we talked about, if you have a larger area, they can prospect around a little bit to find food-rich sites. But then, if it's a small site or even within a large site, they'll select certain types of vegetation. Some birds like to be in the shrub layers. Some like to be at the top of the canopy. So some will like to forage in the shrubs. Some will want to forage in the deciduous trees. Some prefer conifers. So you get a site like this with a lot of vegetation structure and layers, a lot of different species. That's great from the standpoint of a land bird migrant. But also it's got water. So the midges can hatch from this water, and these midges disperse back over the vegetation. They've got that to eat too. So this is the kind of site we look for close to the Great Lake shorelines that make for really good stopover sites for these land birds. So how do we use this information? How do we apply this to our conservation actions? So just talk about 4 things here anyway. One, we've got to make sure we work at the right places. We use our resources well. We tie this in with other economic activities. We use and work with a lot of partners because recall that this is very diffuse, broad front migration. And we still have to fill information gaps to be ever better in our conservation work. So one thing we're doing is we're building geographic information system models based on what we know from other scientists. We're making predictions where the birds should be, and then we're using data layers to drape these over maps and then predict where we should work in the Great Lakes region. We're focusing on a narrow belt around the Great Lakes, all the Great Lakes except for Lake Superior, where stopover sites are not threatened. So this really dark zone you see right here is the area I'll be talking about in a little bit more detail. And then we also know that we can have the best information in the world, but if we don't communicate it to people and it's not used, it's not very good for conservation. So we're now developing some websites. We're going to get some publications out. We'll be giving presentations on this work to encourage other people to do this kind of work. So this is just a development of the first page of our web page. We're going to have a workshop coming up here to have people evaluate this for us to see whether it's really user-friendly. And then this is the kind of input, and it's a little bit complicated, but I'll not that bad. I'm going to reduce it to just one column here. Recall that this is the area that we're working in. This is about a 15, 20-mile zone around the Great Lakes. And what we've done is draw a polygon shown by this yellow line all the way around here. And from this, we can make some calculations that will help us in conservation programs. So if we focus on landbirds right there, we've got scores from 5 to 0, where 5 is the best stopover site and 0 is not suitable habitat. And then if we look at all the area within this area, we can say, based on the work we've done, that about 1.7% of this is very high-ranked habitat for landbirds. Not very much. Of that, based on some other information we put in this work, about 17% is protected. So there's a job ahead of us. And now the next thing we're going to try to do is come up with some goals. At some point, you have to say you've done enough. We've met our goal. So in this case, we're saying roughly 40%. We want 40% of this high-quality habitat protected. So right now, we're at about 26%, which really isn't too bad. So with a little bit of extra effort, another 14% protection in this area of high-quality habitat, we can say, good. And now we can continue working on other conservation projects. So we're also providing other resources as well so that people can access that information. Not everything is going to be in that map you just saw. And then we're providing information how you manage the land and some of the specifics. So we'll see how we've got 12 guinea pigs lined up to see how this website's going to meet their needs in about a week in Ohio. Now let's take a look at how this all takes place on the ground. This is Saginaw Bay. Bay City would be down here. We're going to focus right up here at Tawas Point. Here it is. This is Tawas City, East Tawas, and this is Tawas Point right there. And we've got a lot of forest, got an inland lake, we've got some pastures and some agricultural land out here. So the next thing I show you, keep this in mind, is a map. So we looked at some information, geographic information system information. The dark green are forests, the light green are wetlands, and this is pasture and agricultural land. The red are urban areas. So we start out with this basic information. And then, based on what we know how birds select sites, we've ranked these sites in terms of relative importance to the birds during migration. These red areas are the areas we think are most important. These yellow areas, the orange, are areas less important. Here it's even less important, and even less important out here. So what this tells us, if we want to protect stopover sites for landbirds, this is the best and most effective place to do it. It's expensive because coastal property is expensive. So we need to couple this with other conservation work and with a lot of partners. Fortunately, this is a state park right here, and it's long been recognized as an important stopover site. And I'll go into a little bit of information how birders and others are may help us make this happen over the long term. Tawas Point, this is a quote from John Dunn, who's a well-known birder throughout the U.S. And he says, "My own favorite, indeed my favorite place to bird in all of North America is Tawas Point on Lake Huron. But no doubt there are dozens of other spots along the lake shores which must be nearly as good." So, first of all, it tells you, and a lot of our information is built from places like that, the way we built our predictions. But what this also tells us, our models will identify these areas. And this will help us focus the effort in areas that John Dunn is suggesting they've got to be out there. So, people use that information. People come to Tawas Point to go birding from all across the U.S. and even from outside the U.S. Tour companies come here. They organize tours. You know, a lot of ecotourism is based that way, and they bring groups of 10 to 15 people. And they stay in the lodges and eat in the restaurants during the off-season. So it's a real addition to the economy that normally there wouldn't be people occupying motels and hotels and eating there. There's a birding festival there sponsored by Michigan Audubon Society, and we participate in giving presentations there to help further that effort. So these birders come, and it's just a shot in the economy, and they get several hundred people coming to those festivals. There are also recent estimates that suggest that 11% of the tourists coming to Michigan watch birds. So it's something we can grow on. So maybe this will become part of the Pure Michigan campaign. And birders come in droves. And they've got lots of expensive equipment. So they add to the economy in a lot of ways. And look what they see. So here's a scarlet tanager, freshly arrived from Brazil. They just glow in the dark. That's all I can say. And at a place like Tawas Point, not a lot of vegetation. People get really good looks at them. And that is very appealing to bringing people to a place like that. Or the Kirtland's Warbler that a lot of you know, that breeds almost exclusively in Michigan and winters almost exclusively in the Bahamas. And they show up here during migration. And at this particular festival, because the Kirtland's Warbler breeding areas are close, they also go up and see them on the breeding grounds. So, I think there's great potential to develop ecotourism in the Great Lakes and specifically in Michigan. So let's say someone is coming in from Stockholm, and they do. So they'll say land here in Metro. And the first places they tend to land might be McGee Marsh in Ohio. For those that don't want to go through immigration, or those that are okay with going through immigration, they go to Point Pelee, both of which are internationally renowned birding spots. Both have birding festivals. And in May, these places are just overflowing with birders. You have to make reservations at Point Pelee 6 to 7 months in advance to even get a place to stay. So what people are doing now is that they'll visit these spots, rent a car, then they'll go up to Saginaw Bay and Tawas Point, just what we saw. Then they'll go up and see the Kirtland's Warbler, and then cross the Mackinac Bridge and pay their $4.50 toll and go on up to Whitefish Point. And here you get all kinds of migrating boreal birds and owls and raptors, and thousands of loons migrate past here. You can see over 1,000 in a day. That you do not see, you don't see these loons and those numbers in any of those spots. So the really good birders and the really good tour companies are starting to put packages together to tie that all together. And this is all happening before the main tourist season. So again, it's particularly well received by local economies. Now, the estimate in 2006 for just birding trips by birders worldwide is $10 billion. If you look at any birding magazine these days, you see these pages are just full of tours to the most remote parts of the world. So this is only 1 billion. I apologize for that, but just multiply that by 10. And I don't know if it's recovered since 2006 when the economy was a little bit better, but with a lot of people getting ready to retire, it's probably likely to increase substantially. In order to have a good ecotourism business, you have to have places to go and to watch the birds. So what the Nature Conservancy has done, working with a colleague at Ohio State University, is produce this guideline to creating habitat on your property. So this can be distributed to anybody, and we have specific recommendations on plants to put in. And areas that are particularly favored by the birds. We talked about the proximity to water. And all those kinds of things are contained in this. We have some of these out on the front desk. And then it turns out that this kind of information can be used by local schools. So that school kids are working with various other organizations that have wildlife certification programs, National Wildlife Federation and others, and so they can begin to create these little oases for the birds during migration. And even in my own backyard in East Lansing, I don't particularly like to mow the lawn a lot, so I just kind of every year I'm kind of letting the leaves go out and the sugar maples seed in and planting a few trees. And now I've got ovenbirds and white-throated sparrows and hermit thrushes in my backyard that none of my neighbors have because I'm creating habitat. I don't have to mow as much, so there's less CO2 going in the atmosphere. We also partner with the Wildlife Habitat Council, which has done a great job working with a lot of corporations in southeastern Michigan and southwestern Ontario. We've specifically collaborated on a project right here and here to plant species of plants that are really favored by the birds. We've also worked with the Rouge River plant down here with DTE Energy, and we hope to follow up on that in the future. So each one of these sites contributes to enriching that network of stopover sites. We also worked with a company in Ohio, east of Cleveland, right on Lake Erie. They had about 10 acres of grassland, and they had to mow it. They had a $10,000 contract to do that every year. So what we suggested with them is just let it grow up. They saved $10,000 and create stopover habitat. Seems like a pretty easy thing to do. And we've worked with other companies similarly. So we've worked with DTE Energy and went with their staff. They've done some soft engineering at their River Rouge plant, which is better for all kinds of birds. They planted prairie species, they planted shrubs, and 30 acres of grass is now 30 acres of stopover site in the middle of an urban area. So in effect, this is acting as a fire escape. And a study I just read about 3 or 4 days ago suggesting that this area is a major corridor for landbirds. We're also working with Consumers Energy and Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge to take out exotic plants, to create better habitat for the birds, native species that provide better food. And so Greg Norwood here of Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge is helping in that effort. We've also collaborated with a colleague of mine in Ohio, James Cole, has been working with Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and what they are doing is converting agricultural land to wetlands. So they're just now finishing up 14 acres of habitat creation that will provide stopover habitat for waterfowl like this blue-winged teal and for shorebirds like this solitary sandpiper. And there's another 1,500 acres in the Pike ready to be done. So this is all really, really important stuff, and the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge staff have been really grateful for the partnership, and we've also been really grateful for the expertise provided by Ducks Unlimited to do some of the engineering that's required. I should also add that in these areas, we're specifically building in passageways for fish. So whenever we look at stopover habitat, we're trying to consider other kinds of conservation objectives so it can be as comprehensive as possible. And a real exciting project has also taken place in Wisconsin. Here's Lake Michigan here. And what they did, working with a local land trust, this is a golf course, or I should say was. The local land trust purchased this 116 acres, and they're converting the whole thing over to stopover habitat. Really cool stuff, because here's Lake Michigan right here. As we talked about the importance of birds falling out or landing right on the nearest land from the lake. So this too is an example of how we're using this information to get work done on the ground. And the Michigan chapter of TNC is working to restore Erie Marsh down by Toledo, here in Michigan. So we're going to be looking at revamping the dikes, recreating wetlands, and this is a really important area for migrating waterfowl and shorebirds and landbirds, for that matter, on the cottonwoods that occur on the dikes. Now, I should add there was a lot we don't know, so we work with a lot of people. I work with a lot of graduate students, a lot of faculty at universities across the Midwest to answer the unknowns that we need to have resolved to better refine our conservation work. So here's some example of, in this case, working in the Bahamas with Bahamian students. So Ingeria Miller here is actually looking for every little ant inside that plot to try to estimate insect abundance for the birds in the Bahamas. And here is Ingeria again, and she's tracking a bird that we put a transmitter on to see how it moves around the landscape and use the landscape. And Lino Davis here, who's also been early on in this project, helping us with the work. And this is the Kirtland Warbler we've been studying down there. So, in stopover site conservation, we've got to take a range-wide perspective. It's got to be broad scale to be successful. To be successful, we also have to be focused. So those of us that work in the Great Lakes are focusing here. But we're always kind of keeping our eye open for this broader picture and how we can look at this broader picture. So, fortunately, we've had a lot of support here in Michigan, and I thank the Fosters who are here tonight for helping us a lot with this work. In looking at the Kirtland's Warbler in the Bahamas. This is getting at this range-wide perspective. So here we are. This is a Kirtland's Warbler. You can see it's got color bands right here, and here's the government band. So this is what we fondly call BBXR. Blue, blue, X is the government band, and the red band. Here he is in the Bahamas. Here he is in Michigan. So I've got a number right here. And what do you think that represents? Anybody? Okay, getting in the right direction here. I'm sorry?
How many migrations?
Close. Getting closer yet? All right, I'll tell you right now. It's not an unlucky number, right? This is a number of days it took for a Kirtland's Warbler to fly from Eleuthera up here. 1,500 miles. And this bird weighs less than an ounce. So that's the shortest. And how did we come up with that? We just had observers down here in the Bahamas. I went back to the same spot. We knew where this bird was. Recorded the last date it was seen. And then we had members of our team up here in Michigan at its territory from the year before. And the first day we saw it back, that gives you the number of nights it took. Now, this doesn't mean that it flew every night. It was probably just maybe 3 of those nights or 4 of those nights that it flew. It probably obviously had to fly across the Atlantic, maybe landed somewhere in this coastal area, stop and refuel at a stopover site, wait for the right weather conditions that we talked about, so because it's coming north, waiting for those south winds, and then heading back up. Now, part of, if we look at conservation, to really be successful, there has to be capacity in the Bahamas as well as here to implement conservation. Nature Conservancy has a Northern Caribbean program who have strongly supported the work we've been doing, and in fact, we're on, not quite on the ground floor because we didn't have a Nature Conservancy chapter when we started, but once they were established, we worked with them very closely, and our Bahamian colleagues recruited all these students. So one extremely gratifying part of this whole program is that we trained these students for 2 winters in the Bahamas from November through 1st of May. We provided funds for them to come to Michigan to see the bird, and also learn some other conservation techniques. And then we provided them support to finish their undergraduate education with the commitment, as much as one can get a commitment of this sort, to return to the Bahamas and become conservationists, and thereby increase capacity. So here we have Lino Davis here, who's the first student in our program. He did very well, we went to University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. We supported him through his undergraduate education. He went on to get his master's degree and then went back to the Bahamas and worked for the Nature Conservancy until very recently when he left. Now he's entered a PhD program at Miami University. So he's just been a remarkable kid and just moved it all the way through. And I think he's going to be a real rising star. He recently was named to the board of the Society of the Conservation and Study of Caribbean Birds. So not only is it a Bahama effect, but throughout the Caribbean. And Zico, who I could never get him to stop calling me Dr. Ewert. I always thought it's Dave, but it was always Dr. Ewert. To this day, I'll be seeing him in about a month. I'll be interested to see what he has to say. But he went on to get his degree here at Northern Michigan University, got his master's degree there, and is now teaching at college at the Bahamas. So he is training other students, which is the kind of leverage that we want. And Jerria Miller went to Cornell, and then she has returned back to the Bahamas and is serving on a commission that evaluates environmental impact statements for the Bahamas, large-scale proposed development projects. So she too has gone back and done exactly what we had hoped. And Keith Philippe is just recently completed his degree at University of Minnesota, working with a colleague of mine there. And Keith also plans to go on to get his master's degree and come back. So a lot of these students are still getting their education, and we continue to work with them. And we're really having a workshop in which actually all of these students are coming back, and we're going to have a reunion of all these students in April. So it'll be a great way for them to pool stories and self-reinforce what they've done. Now, what we've based on a lot of the information that we've learned with these students and others, we're trying to figure out how you create habitat in the Bahamas in the context of Bahama culture and Bahama economy. Now, Kirtland's warblers use early succession habitat, so it requires a disturbance to get there. It can be slash and burn agriculture. Bahamians love to bulldoze. There's a lot of fire in some systems and occasionally hurricanes. We don't think hurricanes have a lot of influence on the birds. Fires mostly on the Pine Islands. Bulldozers, yes. And slash and burn agriculture, yes. So a lot of the changes appear to be anthropogenic or human caused. But they result in this kind of habitat that Kirtland's warblers like. Real thick, dense stuff. So when I'm in the office and I'm going to the Bahamas, everyone, of course, assumes I'm going right to the beach. But here, there should be evidence that's not the case. So what are we doing now? When I started my career in biology and ornithology, the last thing I thought I would be doing is goat farming. What we found out is that Kirtland's warblers reach their highest numbers in the Bahamas on goat farms. It probably is a reflection of what goats browse and what they do not. So what we did was set up some exclosures, and this first year, we had to take these goats out a mile every day from their pen to the exclosure where we would then document what they ate. And I tell you, I'm not sure who was in charge, whether it was the goats or whether we were. So we used all kinds of tricks, and finally we ended up putting a little bit of corn, and this came from the local dump. We would just trail us behind, and the goats would kind of follow behind the corn. Now, Jeannie here is our project director down there, was very creative and very patient. And now we kept them in there, so we put up electric fences and stuff like that to protect them from dogs. But what we're doing now is then trying to look at this, how do you make this work economically? So where in the Bahamian landscape does a company or an entity want early succession habitat all the time? It's under power lines. And you have to do it at a large enough scale that it's going to do some good for the birds. So what's better than an electric company? The Bahamas Electricity Company. They've got power lines throughout the Bahamas. So what we're doing is we're talking with them, and they're going to be attending our workshop next week. And we're going to propose the possibility of using goats to browse under the lines so they can save money potentially on bulldozing. We don't know if it's going to work yet or not, but we're experimenting with this, and that's one of the things we're working with on this workshop. So we met with them, they were kind of intrigued, and their first response is, it's got to make sense economically. So we've gone from this real intensive research on Kirtland's warblers to figure out how do you make this work in a country like this. And we've got a lot of good Bahamian colleagues, so they're beginning to think of us, we'll never be Bahamians, but we're not pure Americans anymore. So maybe we can make a little bit of headway. So with that, I just want to thanks for listening and for all the support you've had in helping the birds, both here at Cranbrook and TNC and elsewhere. And you've got some exciting presentations coming up. Lindsay Chatterton will be talking about aquatic species on March 21st. And Helen will have a grand finale on how we're approaching conservation at these broad, ambitious scales. And we thank you again for the many ways that I know a lot of you have supported our work, including the bird work. And we'll end there. I'll be happy to take any questions. I presume there's some lights that come on. Yeah.
We have a cabin in the woods in Tawas, and down the road from us, Plank Road, Essex Road, they've done a lot of work with the land and making it habitable for the Kirtland Warbler. And I often stop by to see what's transpiring there. What I don't understand is where do birds make their nests?
They put them right in the ground. They sink them right in the ground. So they actually sink it down a little bit, a lot of fine lining, often right underneath the jack pine. Yeah.
And so the jack pine can get how tall before they have to do this all over again? Cut down the trees.
The Kirtland warblers will abandon jack pine areas when they reach about 15 to 20 feet. And then what the current management scenario is to let the trees grow until they're about 60 years old. And then they'll clear cut the trees and create new habitat. So it's a very regular cycle. Yeah.
Robins, you started talking about robins. Suzanne and I were in Northville last week, and it was starting to snow, and there were 30 robins that came all at once. Now, someone said to me years ago that it started with such a small group of robins didn't migrate, stayed. They found enough food, and then their children and their children, and so we got more and more robins staying. Is it because migration is so hard on the birds that if they can stay, they do? What's with our robins?
Well, robins, I don't know if it's been looked at with quite that perspective. But, yeah. And maybe that, I can give you one, there's an example in Europe where that's taking place, but in the robins here probably stay here in the winter when there's a lot of fruit, because that's what they feed on in the winter. If there's virtually no fruit, you won't see them. But there's a bird in Europe that is now used to just migrate to Spain and Portugal, but then a small number started going to the UK, a shorter migration route, probably a little safer. And now a whole group of these European birds is moving and wintering in Europe, and they come back earlier than the birds from Spain. And there's some talk they might even be creating 2 new species. So, strange things can happen. Yeah.
You said they migrate by night.
Yes.
Do they navigate by the stars?
They do. They use the stars. They use magnetic fields. There's even some thought that near bodies of water, they'll listen to the waves, and that will help them orient so they're not really that high up. So, and they even use polarized light to get themselves oriented just at dusk. Yeah.
I noticed that one of the first slides where you showed the blue, the wintering and the migration. Are they migrating in August, or are birds leaving in August, some of them?
Yes. It's kind of, if you're an ornithologist, you look at the seasons in kind of a weird way, I think. To me, spring begins about now when the cardinals start to sing, which they're doing. To me, so spring is here. But the flip side is fall. The first shorebirds are back by the 4th of July. So summer's over as far as I'm concerned on the 4th of July. And then you start to get the small little landbirds showing up in the Bahamas as early as the 1st of August. Once they're done breeding, they put on the new feathers. Why stick around? Let's just go south. I don't have anything else to do except to eat. Up here, they're pretty busy raising young.
I thought I wasn't seeing them in August because they weren't busy feeding their young, but they're actually gone then.
Some are gone, but they're also much quieter then because when they're molting feathers, they're not singing or anything like that. So it's a combination of the two. Yeah.
Do we really have any more bugs than they do in the Bahamas?
In the spring, we have a lot more. Yeah. There's just, well, you know, everything comes out in the spring and all the caterpillars, and we all know that they're mosquitoes. So that's just indicative of this huge flush that the birds need. They need that extra flush of food. They have the extra resources to raise their young. They couldn't do it in the Bahamas. Yeah.
I heard that it was dangerous, the windmills, because they want to put the windmills in the same area where the wind blows that blow the birds use to migrate. Is that?
It's an interesting question. We've done some evaluation of that. And if you look at sources of mortality of birds, a recent study came out indicating that cats are by far and away the biggest source of mortality for birds, including apparently native species. And I haven't seen all the details of this study yet, but it's estimated that cats take over 1 billion birds annually. Then next are collisions with buildings and cars. That's estimated to be in the hundreds of millions. Wind turbines are way down on the list for birds. So I think there's still areas it'd be good to be cautious because we still don't have the studies that look at mortality, say in bad weather conditions when the birds are coming down to a stopover site and leaving. So that's when you have the greatest potential because the birds are usually flying way above turbines, so that's usually not a problem. It's only when they're coming up and down and probably only when the weather conditions are bad. So it's a kind of a, if you look at it in that perspective, it's not the major cause of mortality of migrating birds. Still something to be careful of. You don't want to put it in a Tawas point, that kind of stuff, but use a little judicious sighting guidance, and I think you can avoid the worst that way. Yep. Yeah.
Would you please explain why these tiny little songbirds can fly across great bodies of water, but raptors have a problem and they use the updraft wing, but they don't really cross a body of water?
Yeah, there are a number of factors here. The landbirds that migrate over these large bodies of water, they feed intensively, so they put on the extra reserves that are needed to power the flight. And they migrate at night, as I mentioned, because that minimizes the energy requirements. So with that extra energy, they can make it. Even hummingbirds can make that 600 miles. And some raptors can do that too. Something like a peregrine falcon or a harrier readily cross bodies of water. But those that are soaring raptors, like red-tailed hawks and buteos, things of that sort, depend upon the thermals, which do not form over the water. Hence, you're right, they're restricted to the land. Yeah.
There was an article in the paper stating that because of global warming, the hummingbirds are coming back a little bit early, and we won't be having the bugs and the flowers for them to use as the nectar. Do you know anything about that?
Well, a study just came out 3 days ago on that topic. And it's suggesting that hummingbirds are arriving about 2 weeks earlier than they were 30 years ago. It's not clear yet how that coincides with the food supply. And that study didn't address that particular question. The other thing that makes it, they can't give you a straightforward answer to that, is that the spring, if you look at the area between the Gulf of Mexico and the southern part of Lake Michigan, in some parts, is actually, on average, later than it was 30 years ago. And in some places, it's earlier. So it's a very tricky thing that the birds are dealing with. And so the food supply, it's not always clear what it is. And in some cases, they may just stop, sort of like this fire escape, just kind of persist for a while, and then kind of move on until conditions are better.
But I was birds migrating according to the killing of land and the life of land input rather than the temperature.
It varies with the group of birds. So birds that go way, way down in the tropics, like that black-polled warbler that winters in Brazil, that is, the departure of migration is primarily determined by the light, as it is, and to some degree by other birds too. But it will be mediated by weather more for birds that winter in the southern U.S. than they do in Brazil, because the weather patterns are somewhat similar between southern U.S. and here. So if you got a really cold, nasty winter that affects all of eastern North America, those birds are kind of delayed because they don't have the resources to put the fat on, but the birds in Brazil don't know any better. So that's creating this little bit of a discrepancy in where the birds originate and how they're responding to climate change. Yeah.
I attended a lecture on hummingbirds a couple of years ago, and he told us to put out our hummingbird feeders by April 15th, just because of it.
Okay. Was this Alan Chartier, maybe? Okay.
However, that spring, we didn't get it out. And so we didn't get it out up until maybe June. It was right there, the hummingbird.
Uh-huh. They find it quickly, don't they? Yeah. Wait, back there?
You mentioned you were looking for one goal of 40% for a certain type of land use. How do you arrive at your goals?
Yeah, great question. The way we did that is we went through the literature and we looked at those studies that describe the proportion of landscape in varying amounts of natural cover. And the density of birds kind of levels off when you get to that 40% level. If you're just have tiny, tiny little patches of habitat, you get real high densities of birds, so they crowd in, fewer food resources, and probably lower quality stopover. But at that 40% threshold, it begins to even out. So we figured if you get up to that 40%, it's probably okay for the birds. Make sense?
Yeah. So it's more at what goal can you achieve sustainability of that population?
Yeah, it's kind of trying to look at the condition of the bird relative to the landscape. Yep. Try to get them through as well as you can. Yeah.
We have a number of feeders in our yard, and there are birds there all the time. So are there some birds that don't migrate, or are we spoiling them and keeping them to migrate?
Yeah, there are many birds that don't migrate. Ruffed grouse, some blue jays, some crows, some chickadees, but some chickadees migrate. Tufted titmice don't typically migrate. White-breasted nuthatches. So quite a few species that do not, but at the latitude of Michigan, the majority of the species migrate just because conditions are so poor and food resources are really limited. I don't know how many of you know golden-crowned kinglets, but they're just tiny little birds, and they just have to feed all the time. Some of them will winter this far north, but if they don't get enough food supply, they can just die at night because they didn't get enough. Yeah.
You had mentioned, if I heard you correctly, the number one cause of death, migrating birds are cats. Now, where do they find the cats? When they come down at night, or how do they
When the birds,
find them?
yeah, the cats just find them when they land, that's all. And it's not necessarily just migrating birds, but birds in general. Yeah. So you got to, like I said, I haven't read that paper. I need to read that paper a little bit more carefully, but it could be that there'll be more common birds you see around yards or around farms and things like that. It's unlikely to affect Kirtland's warblers too much, although we do have one case where we think a feral cat in the Bahamas did take a Kirtland's warbler. Yeah.
It seems that I'm seeing a few more blue jays. Are they starting to come back after the West Nile virus?
Exactly. Same thing with crows. And chickadees was another group of birds that was hit. Yeah.
Do you have any information on the effect of migrating birds on the oil spill in the Gulf and the shoreline of Louisiana and the other places that you get the oil sludge?
I don't know specifically what happened there. The only thing I know that I think I can speak to with some degree of certainty is that the piping plovers that breed here in the Great Lakes, some of which are on the Gulf Coast, did not appear to be influenced by that spill. That's about as much as I could say. Some of the colonies of birds were disrupted for a while, to be sure, but often some of the offshore islands of Louisiana.
I just got back from Florida and the Gulf shoreline was full of oil sludge balls. And it was all along the shoreline, and that was on the Florida side, so I was wondering, what happened up in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't followed it that closely. Yeah, my expertise is mostly with the Great Lakes and Bahamas, and I have to talk with my colleagues down there to see what they're learning.
Because they were flying through there to get up.
That's true. Some of the birds were, but when you're talking about landbirds, they're flying above that. So for those birds, it's probably not too much of a factor. Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of migrating birds like fruit trees and fruit. Is there anything that you recommend in this area, what type of fruiting shrub or tree to plant?
Yeah, Juneberry. So Juneberry or serviceberry. Birds really love those. Let's see, blueberries, raspberries. They go for those in a big way. See, I'm kind of drawing a blank here. Dogwoods in the fall of all sorts are very popular. Gray dogwood, red osier dogwood. And those are often ornamental plants. Yeah, the shrub is good. There are not too many trees that produce fruit, but black cherry draws in a lot of birds in late summer.
I know that I've had Sargent's crabs, and it's not a native species, I don't believe. It does produce a nice red berry, and it seems like when they swoop in, they're all shriveled up. I don't know if they're like fermented or very sweet or something, but there's like one moment when all these, I have one at work as well, and the birds just swoop down and then just gobble all those berries and they're gone within minutes.
Okay.
Sargent's crabs seem to be able to.
Yeah, they do. They do. And mountain ash is another one. And then certain fruiting species are favored by different bird species and at different times of the winter, right? So it's a pretty complex sort of interaction, but all of those I think would attract some birds. Or something like waxwings, they just come in en masse and take everything off and then move on to the next one. So.
How effective do you think it is for, like, people here with their red lot, putting out stuff to do? Does that really help them a lot, like migratory birds?
Yes, I mean the type of landscaping you put in?
Right.
Yeah, well, like I said, it definitely. In my backyard, as I mentioned, I've just let things grow up, and I put in serviceberry, I put in tamarack and black spruce and hemlock and blueberries, and I've got black raspberries, and I just let them spread across the lawn. And same with dogwood, gray dogwood. It spreads like crazy. And but as far as I'm concerned, it's great. I just love to look out the window and there's a hermit thrush hopping across, or white-throated sparrow. And the other day I had, for those of you that are bird watchers, a small flock of Bahamian waxwings moved through the yard. And so I would encourage you to do that. And like I said, you help just this tiny little bit with global warming, you help a tiny bit with the birds, but if you add it all up, how many millions of yards are there? It's good. Yeah.
How much of your work involves dealing with state or local governments, and even discussion of alternative land use in Detroit, a lot of these lands? Is there any opportunity there for migratory stopover?
Yeah, we're going to try to explore that actually in the near term to see how we can most effectively do that. It's probably, given the vast number of governments that there are, We'll focus on areas based on where we think the most important stopover sites are, and then zero in that way. So, and we did meet with township officials in Michigan, so once we get this final product all done, we're going to put it on their township, the Michigan Township website, so different townships can access it. They estimated that maybe 200 townships in Michigan might be interested in this kind of information. Yeah. Okay, time for one more question. Okay.
Well, you might mention some of the programs around the country. In Detroit, they have the safe passages. Do you know? I think Conserve just got an honorary certificate yesterday.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of organizations work on birds very effectively. So, as you mentioned, the Lights Out program has been safe passage, whatever it's called, different terms in different cities. Toronto, Chicago, Detroit are some of the pioneers. New York is doing this now. So what they'll do is they'll have buildings turn their lights off during peak migration periods, especially when the weather is bad, to minimize collisions with buildings. Very good program. And so we're hoping to see more of that sort of thing take place. National Wildlife Federation has got this backyard certification. I think that's still an active program, and that's been a way to provide guidance on what to do with your backyard to make it better for birds and so forth. So many, many organizations, and we partner with as many as we can. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming tonight. We hope to see you next month. Reminder for those of you who are Institute members, if you're planning to come to the Maple Festival, it's a week from Sunday, and registration closes Monday. Thank you.
I didn't know if you had been in charge of the program.